listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk.
Number 290.
Hello, welcome back to another podcast at the Outdoor Station, and this one is a belter. Have you noticed recently the flurry of inspiring podcasts we've been creating, speaking to interesting people doing interesting things? The people are getting away from the dull economic crisis, the miserable weather, and the boring headlines. Yes, we speak to people who inspire us to do things because they're doing things. Take cycle touring, for example. It's popular, especially during these financially tight times. So, how about this? Have you heard about the Solar Cyclists? No, Neither have I. However, they've just cycled around the world. They left on the 14th of May of last year and arrived back on the 22nd of February of this year, and cycled in total 13,583 miles, 163 days, and averaging 83.33 miles a day. They consisted of Susie Wheeldon, Jamie Vining and Ian Henderson, and they've been raising money for Solar Aid. Now, what I suggest you do is look at the blog site to accompany this two-part interview. The website address is the solarcyclediaries.com, the solarcyclediaries.com. It's eloquent, it's funny, it's full of useful information, both technical and practical, and when you listen to Susie's voice, you can hear the enthusiasm pouring off the page. This is part one of a two-part interview where Susie tells us how the project came about and the team involved. If you do log on to the blog site as you listen to this, please be prepared to get totally hooked.
Well, the project was to essentially to cycle around the world promoting solar power. But actually that came about through quite a few different channels, because initially the idea stemmed from myself doing various different parts of environmental work. In fact, back in 2004, with a couple of mates setting up a sustainable living website. And so sort of reading about sustainable living and almost the solutions to climate change and things that we could do rather than sort of focusing on the problems and the negative side of that. And then on the other side, I just started to get very, very much into adventure travel and had just completed the Marathon des Sables, which is it's 6 marathons back-to-back in the Sahara. And so I sort of came back from that, and I was chatting with a friend of mine and sort of looking, once I'd sort of recovered from that, for a new adventure and a new challenge. And it sort of struck me that what I would love to do was to do some adventure challenge, but that also involved the promotion of sustainable living or solutions to climate change. And while I'd been in the Sahara, one of the things that had very much had struck me was the intensity of the sunlight, as you could probably imagine. And what I'd done while I was there was I'd taken a small Solio solar panel, and it had charged just my iPod, so that while I was running along, I had music and all the rest of it. And as the days progressed, more and more people's iPods or MP3 players or whatever began to run out, and so they were sort of running through the desert with nothing but their own thoughts. And I was quite happily oblivious to everything, singing along to AC/DC, because I'd got my solar charger with me and was able to sort of charge up my music and also other people's as well. And so I sort of began to read more and more about solar power as a result of that. And so when I was thinking about a big adventure that I could do, the link with solar had sort of been already set in my mind a little bit. And it sort of went through various different stages of what it could be, including sort of taking a solar rickshaw. They now make these over in India, and I think trying to put them out actually into the mass market in India as well. But that was quite cumbersome in the end. And I spoke to quite a few different companies, including G24, which was the company that ended up sponsoring us and building the solar panels into our bike panniers. And they discussed sort of making it a slightly less ambitious project, using the solar power just for our communications kit and doing a bike ride rather than trying to put solar panels onto a bigger piece of machinery. And that's really how it sort of eventually settled on being a bike trip promoting solar power. And I still to this day have no real knowledge of why it was around the world, but I think it was just that wonderful idea of traveling the whole way around the globe. And so I think that's sort of how it ended up, sort of almost randomly becoming a round-the-world trip. But yeah, and the reason that we went through the various different deserts on our trip that we did was also to enable us to promote solar power. And actually, in particular, something called the Desertec concept, which is using solar power from the world's deserts to power cities and towns, not necessarily even next to those deserts, but as far away as the Sahara powering Europe, or from the west of China powering the east, which apparently is a very good potential source of energy.
Right. Let's
sorry, I'm waffling.
I only asked one question. And that was the entire interview over. Right. Well, I want to talk about the solar stuff and the politics and the reaction to that a bit later on, if I may, because I've got a feeling.
Of course you may.
If I can get a word in.
I didn't even pause for breath. I don't know how you're going to stop it. Okay, I'll slow down. Sorry.
But let's sort of back to the beginning of the project. So it was really more the solar energy side of it that actually started the ball rolling for you before the cycling. Have I got that clear in my mind?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the case. And in fact, I'd actually only cycled 4 times in the previous 10 years. And I'd fallen off 2 of those times, once quite dramatically, rolling in a sort of a commando roll across the road, which I was quite impressed by, actually. So I hadn't been a cyclist particularly before. But with a friend of mine, Jamie, who eventually I managed to convince to come around the world with me, I took a trip down to Spain, and really just to trial, whether long-distance cycling would be something that I'd enjoy, having been a runner more than a cyclist. And I absolutely loved it, and so was kind of hooked from there.
Yeah, hooked. Okay. Now, just to give people a bit of a background about yourself, I'm reading and doing a bit of cyber stalking, as I have been doing the last couple of days about you. I can see that you've got a bit of a history doing snowboarding and obviously marathon running or extreme running. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my hobbies as well, which I haven't done for quite a while, is also urban free running, so sort of running around cities and jumping off buildings. Yeah, it's amazing. It's the most incredible way of keeping fit because, one, it's a bit like being a child and playing because you're just running around and jumping on things. And two, it's extremely energetic. You sort of pretty much use every muscle because even more than running, you're sort of pulling yourselves over things and jumping over things as well. And so if you ever want to try it out, give it a go.
Yeah, well, also, I was going to say, it leads into the fact it's obviously got you used to falling over and picking yourself up.
Yes, it has. But actually the beauty of falling off a bike is that, well, particularly when you're loaded down, if you fell off a bike without panniers on, I think it would hurt more, but I've only really ever fallen off continuously at least, with panniers on the bike, and they hit the floor before you do. So now I'm a little bit worried that I might start sticking some back on my bike when I take a corner too far.
Safety bars.
Protection, yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so now let's obviously give the other couple of guys I mentioned as well who you went on the trip with, or started the trip with at least. Tell me about James and Ian.
So, Jamie, he was a friend of mine from university, and he has always been an extremely keen cyclist. From a young age, he lived on the Isle of Wight, and so he basically, rather than persuading his parents to let him out and take him everywhere, he was always on his bike going from friends' houses all the way around the island, quite continuously. And he had a background in gymnastics, actually. He did that at a young age, just sort of a county level. So he was always a very energetic guy, and he was just building a house in France, and he agreed sort of early on in the I suppose the organisational process to come across France with me if I was ever going to go any further. And I think then sort of went home one evening and sat down and realised that his house, he hadn't got a mortgage on it. It could technically wait. And whenever, when do you get an opportunity? Does someone say, do you fancy cycling around the world? And so yeah, in the end, he sort of actually just decided that he'd come along for the whole trip, which was fantastic. And then Ian is a good friend of mine from a very young age, and I was actually at an event with him for his sister, and we just got chatting, and he was asking me what I was up to, and I was saying, well, I'm thinking of planning a round-the-world cycling trip. And he had, it was exactly at that moment, organising a cycle trip to Australia. And so we decided to combine forces, and so he decided to come with us instead.
I'm just trying to get the sort of background so I can get the explain it to our listeners where you were coming from. I mean, you've obviously got a lot of the environmental side of it is an important part of this trip. You're a fit group of people anyway, and you're keen on adventure travel. Am I right in thinking this is not sort of a do it on the cheap, rough camp and see where we go? You sound very, very structured sort of people, so you obviously planned fairly detailed exactly your route, where you were staying, and obviously the solar visits you were doing en route.
It was sort of a mixture of very, very unplanned and quite organised in that I decided the route. So the guys had to, unfortunately, like it or lump it. When I managed to tell them that they'd be going through the Sahara in the summer, they weren't that pleased, and particularly through a lot of Middle Eastern countries where all the women are covered head to toe for a long time. But that was the solar aspect. The idea was to try and promote this, the Desert Tech concept by going through the deserts in that way. And as part of that, we had various different projects that we visited along the routes. And so the dates of those were set, albeit that we actually had to change a couple, and particularly in China, we had to move one back a bit because of our we got a little bit delayed. But in terms of where we were staying, it was completely unplanned, and we didn't have any guidebooks really when we set off, or any idea other than sort of a Google printout of the map of where roughly we were going to go. And really was just sort of where you end up is where you try and find accommodation, or if there's nothing you camp, or you might choose to camp because you don't want to be staying where there is available. So it was a mixture of the two, but we are a little bit older, I suppose, than sort of, when you're first potentially going to do this as more of a gap year project. And so we did probably stay in hotels more than you might if you were doing it sort of at 18 or at 21. But those weren't necessarily particularly nice hotels, but I definitely think we probably did it in a slightly more luxurious way than we would have done 10 years ago.
Okay, now looking at the preparation and planning side of it then, with that in mind, obviously you guys are sort of, I think, early 30s, is that right? Something like that? Yeah. Okay, so you've got some experience, and obviously there's a few pennies there stashed away. Were the sponsors helping you financially, or just sort of with equipment on this?
Nokia helped us financially, which was very, very good. Well, for us, obviously, but also with kit. So they provided us with phones and the communications kit that we had, which all had sort of tracking stuff in it, and also the phones that we had allowed us to sort of have various different maps and navigational stuff on them. And then the solar power company just provided us with the solar panels, and I suppose almost a bit more sort of PR and support in that way. And then the We Support Solar campaign, which has I don't know what the actual term is, but Charlotte Webster, who works for Solar Century, was working on behalf of the solar industry as a whole for the We Support Solar campaign. So although Solar Century didn't help us out financially or with any kit, they were very helpful in terms of in terms of a bit of promotion for the trip as well, because we were supporting that We Support Solar campaign, as were Solar Aid, the charity that we were raising money for.
So you were funding all your own, the rest of the equipment, the bikes and the spares and that sort of things, yeah?
Yeah, as I say, we did get a little bit of money from Nokia, to help with kit and sort of visas and that sort of thing. But we did also have to fund quite a lot of the trip ourselves.
Okay, now looking at obviously, what I must say to people, if I haven't mentioned it already in the introduction to this, is to have a look at your blog site and the website associated with the trip, because I've lost hours just reading it. You're very eloquent and very funny the way you write.
Oh, thank you.
Which is www.solarcyclediaries.com, and make sure you've got a very large coffee before you start reading it, because you'll be gone and you'll be thinking, well, where's my bike? I left it somewhere safe. Anyway, the kit. Now, obviously you're travelling across continents. You left here, I think it was it October time in the UK?
No, actually we left on the 15th of May, so we actually left just before the summer, and the trip in total took us roughly 9 months. It was meant to be a 12,000-mile trip, but again, as I say, it was just my thumb and Google Maps that did the estimation of distance, so it ended up being 13,500 instead. But yeah, so it was 15th of May that we actually left.
Okay, so for people who are sort of going off on long trips and so on, everybody starts to, once they've worked out the practicalities of where they want to go and so on, they start to think about equipment. Now, because you were crossing continents and obviously going through a whole massive range of weather conditions, the logistics in equipment and clothing and so on must have been something else that was a bit of a troublesome thing to organise.
It was a little, but not too badly so. Basically, what we did before going was to find the lightest possible tents and sleeping bags and cooking equipment, because we figured that we'd be going a very long distance, and for the increase in price that it would be, bearing in mind that we'd be living in our tents quite a lot of the time, and for having sort of lighter, durable, good kit would actually be worth it for the amount of use that we would get out of it and how important to us it was. And so we ended up buying, I think it was our tents were by Terra Nova, and they were extremely lightweight. I think some of the lightest in the world, and I think it's Cumulus that did the sleeping bags that we had, which are nice sort of goose down and very, very light as well. So that was great. And we had sort of an Omni stove for our cooking. Although, in fact, we actually ended up just using gas for quite a lot of the trip. But there were certain areas of the world where you couldn't get gas, such as the Western Chinese desert and a few other places. So you need to have something that will allow you to cook where you don't have the ability to buy refills of gas unless you're going to sort of take a massive canister with you. So we did have to sort of consider that fairly carefully before we went. But in terms of actual kit for the weather you mentioned, we were very woefully underprepared for the cold weather we encountered because, we'd looked at this and gone, we're going to the deserts, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. It'll all be hot. And unfortunately, it wasn't. So when we hit snow in China, I didn't even have any shoes. I had my cycling shoes, but other than that, I just had flip-flops. Some very embarrassing photos of flip-flops and socks somewhere else.
Yeah, and virtually frostbite as well, I noticed.
Yeah. Well, I don't know where you draw the line of what's frostbite and what's just a horrible, horrible chilblain, but I've still got some on my toe now where the skin, basically the skin sort of all went swirled and then split open and then it went black, and I got a deep gash wound in one of my toes that's still there, and it must have been about 5 months ago now. So it was pretty. Well, I would say it was pretty painful. It wasn't painful, which was a problem because the guys were complaining that they had cold feet, and I was telling them to stop being so silly because mine had been numb for such a long time that I couldn't feel it, and they sort of looked at me and went, "Numb's not good." So yeah, in terms of that, I think we could have been a little bit better prepared for the colder weather.
So you're telling me then that the clothing that you took, you actually carried everything that you thought you were going to need from the word go? You didn't sort of send anything ahead of parcels ahead to pick up on the way?
No, not at all. I mean, we bought a few clothes when we did get cold. I bought a jacket in China, and we bought I bought some shoes so that I could actually walk around, and a rug. But other than that, no, we just sort of picked a few things up on the way. It wasn't technical kit, but it was, you can always buy a spare jumper or a spare jacket, wherever you are in the world, really.
Yeah. So in that case, I'm very impressed because I've seen the obviously pictures there with Boris Johnson at the beginning when he was sending you off. With a tear in his eye, and and asking daft questions about why aren't they solar powered, and you said he was. So I mean, and the bags that were custom made by the solar company obviously are not that much bigger, if bigger at all, than the sort of standard cycle panniers. I mean, you were not particularly laden with equipment, were you? No,
not at all. In fact, they are just normal cycle panniers where they actually sewed the solar panel into it because it's this new flexible solar. So they're it's the one that's not Ortlieb. I'm terrible. But they were Altura, I think it is, our panniers. And I had the guys had the bigger panniers. I don't know what the sizings are, but they had the larger Altura panniers, and I actually just had the smaller ones on my bike. And then we had our tents and our roll mats on top of the bike rack, and that was pretty much it. Sometimes we had to sort of literally strap food and water on top of that, but other than that, we were actually very light compared to all of the cyclists really that we passed.
It's interesting, actually. I mean, cycle touring is we've got a lot of listeners and customers as well who do cycle touring, and they're starting to increasingly now reduce weight. But you do still see them heading off to the continent with a remarkable amount of equipment laden on the front and rear panniers.
Absolutely, you do, and many of the people that we came across during our travels had panniers both at the front and the back, and then had a large bag across the top of the back panniers as well. And I just sort of looked at them and thought, how on earth can you get up the hills? Because some of the hills, were pretty steep, and I was struggling with the weight that I had in my lowest gear. So I don't know how they do it. I really don't. But I mean, my hat's off to anyone that carries that much all over. But for us, speed was more of an interest, and we weren't really worried about. I mean, obviously we were washing our clothes constantly, but the places we were going, we didn't need to look particularly good. So that wasn't much of an issue. And we would try to interact with people where we were, so we didn't really take that much in the way of reading material or that kind of thing. We sort of maybe had one book at a time that we might take with us each and sort of swap that as we went along. But really, we were found that obviously there was a few areas where we really were away from everything. But in the main, we were going through enough towns and cities that, sort of your basic necessities of, toothpaste and, I suppose a spare pair of knickers or whatever that you might come across needing, you could buy that on the way.
Yes, I say equally impressed all the time, because I, for some reason, visualised that you had obviously sent parcels ahead to pick up on way to just replenish some of the equipment. But it's even more impressive that the actual equipment lasted quite happily for the 9 months.
It did in terms of my equipment. There was actually a couple of problems with Jamie's, because actually, I don't know, because it's quite complicated to sort of follow the exact trail of the events through the blog, but Ian left in Egypt but then came back out to join us in Central Asia. So we were actually quite fortunate, because at that particular point, Jamie's, the rim of his wheel had literally split, and he was sort of cycling along with, I was carrying his bags at that time because they were heavier than mine, and praying that it wouldn't, the spokes wouldn't completely pull through and the wheel essentially collapsed before we got to Uzbekistan, where Ian was rejoining us. So there was that one opportunity to get some stuff brought out to us through him. And we were very fortunate then that we didn't have any real problems then until the US, where it was quite easy to get kit. But my kit on my bike was not replaced for the whole time. I changed my chain twice, I think, only because I felt I should.
You just didn't want to get your nails dirty.
I didn't want to get my nails dirty, although I can do chains and punctures, but anything other than that, it starts getting a bit technical. But I was absolutely amazed by my bike not breaking down more than it did. And in fact, my tyres, I'm still using the bike now, and my tyres they're not worn. They're Marathon Schwalbe. Again, we weren't sponsored by them, but they're amazing. They didn't work as well for the guys, but I guess they're a bit heavier and were carrying slightly more weight than I was. But I was amazed that after so many miles that the tyres are still good for now. They're still going.
Okay, well, we've sort of reversed the interview as normal. We normally talk about kit at the end, but we've got there already. We're on to the trip itself in a second. So what were the bikes that you were riding then, and did you do any sort of basic modifications to it to make it more comfortable before you went?
Mine was a Surly touring bike frame and various different parts. There's a lovely guy in a shop called Bicycle in Richmond who put it all together for me. And basically they sort of, they put on my handlebars. I wanted the butterfly one, so they had that ability to change my hand position around the handlebars to sort of stop any sort of carpal tunnel and that kind of thing. And they're actually Brompton bike handlebars, because the butterfly handlebars don't really come in women's sizes very much, so they had to sort of take them off a Brompton bike. So mine was quite custom built to me. Ian got a Thorn bike, one of the long distance ones with the Rollhoff hub, which didn't have any problems at all while he was using it. And Jamie had a little bit less of a budget actually to get his bike, so he just bought an aluminium frame off eBay and custom built it up himself. And really surprisingly, that's still going strong as well. He was sort of constantly amazed every day. But perhaps I don't know whether it wasn't as strong as the steel frames that we had, which is perhaps why he had a couple more problems with the with his sort of wheels and that kind of thing. I don't know how, whether it would affect down to there, but he had a lot more punctures as well. But other than that, none of us really, suffered too badly with our bikes, and they stayed pretty strong all the way through.
And were you using cleats or just using toe traps at all?
Oh, absolutely using cleats. We actually met a couple who were they were actually just cycling in flip-flops, and they made the decision not to take cycling shoes for a weight perspective. And I think they were really regretting that particular choice. And now, even cycling around town, if I don't have my cleats fixed into the pedals, then I sort of already feel that lack of strength that you have, the extra power that they give you. I would absolutely, definitely suggest it on any long distance trip to sort of get used to clipping into your pedals.
Wow. Okay. Right. Well, I think we've covered equipment in sort of fairly good detail there. If there's anything else that comes out as we talk, then do by all means mention it. Especially if there's anything sort of tips and so on, which I'm going to ask you at the end, sort of thing.
Okay.
Now, I mean, I can see that if I ask you to tell me about the trip, we could actually be here for the rest of the evening. So I'm just sort of wondering, can you break it into sections for us? I mean, leaving London and sort of the first part of the trip and getting down over to France, and then perhaps going across from France and then take it in sections, sort of key moments that were sort of memorable for whatever reason.
Okay, I said okay. Well, I think probably just the start was absolutely insane because we'd managed to get some support from various different solar companies and Solar Aid and Nokia. We actually had quite a few people coming to see us off, as well as the mayor, as you mentioned earlier. And so it was sort of quite strange in a way because we'd sort of had all this mad panic. We'd all been at work until sort of 3 or 4 days prior, and had sort of rammed everything into our panniers. That morning I was still packing. I hadn't actually got around to doing it. And then we ended up at City Hall and sort of there's this big fanfare to see us off, and we literally got around the corner and had to start repacking and figure out where we were actually going because it was almost we almost hadn't been able to do all that sort of last minute planning because we were so sort of caught up with the actual leaving moment, and so that was crazy. And we actually left with 2 other friends as well, so there was 5 of us going through France, which was wonderful. It was a bit more just like sort of a holiday at that particular point because it wasn't particularly strenuous cycling, and at one particular crazy point we'd only cycled about 200, perhaps even 300 miles, and we got to a wonderful little town called Genli where they have a solar power project, and I'd contacted them beforehand to say we were coming through, and they provided us with a sort of various press people and canapes, and the mayor came out to visit us and all this fanfare, and we just felt so fortunate in that we'd travelled such a short distance in terms of our overall trip, and already we got given medals, and it was just like, thank you very much, but I really don't think we deserve this just yet. So that way it was just such a wonderful time. And then we got across to North Africa. Everywhere. I'll probably repeat how wonderful everywhere was, but it was just started to become a little bit more different to normal life for us because obviously, Europe isn't so different to the UK. But when you start getting into sort of Tunisia and Libya, you begin to see big changes. Obviously, the topography was started to get a lot hotter and a lot sandier, and we were in more Muslim areas, so the architecture was more minarets and mosques and that sort of thing, and the women started to wear more clothes. And I started to get more embarrassed about sort of cycling along in my rolled-up trousers and all the rest of it. But it was absolutely wonderful. The amazing thing about everywhere that we went was that people were incredibly friendly to us all the way around.
Can I just ask you there? Because, certainly going into North Africa, I've been there myself, and there is a distinctive change of atmosphere when you cross over from Spain. And the first thing that crosses your mind, particularly when in my case when I was with my girls, as it were, was sort of the security aspect and just being unsure of the system of politics and social politics. Did you sort of just blazingly just carry on going through and covering up as best you could, or were you a bit sensitive to issues and you just were unsure who to ask from your point of view?
I think that because we were going through initially we sort of got into the area quite gently through Tunisia, which I think more people are sort of used to seeing Western tourists and women that don't necessarily wear a headscarf or these kind of things. And so it's sort of like a gentle introduction. But as we got further into Libya, we went through quite a few areas where you literally don't see any women for quite a long time. And there was one incident where some goat herders tried to get into my tent. I got out and confronted them, and all I could hear around me, because at that particular point we had 4 people with us, because we had to have a guide in Libya for political reasons. They won't let you travel there without a guide. So some poor but wonderful guy called Lamin had to trail us in a car at 50 miles an hour across the entire country. But in any case, there was 4 guys with me at that particular point, and they were all snoring, and no one was coming to my aid at all. And I managed to shoo the goat herders away. And it was all absolutely fine. But what was interesting is when I spoke to Lamin about it, he sort of explaining it wasn't that they thought, basically they just didn't see any women at all. So they assumed the worst of me because they had no knowledge of any woman who would ever walk around who wasn't covered head to toe and would be out with people who weren't her husband or her brother, because this was a particular area where women didn't hardly left the home. And so they did assume that it was rather more easy than I was, because it didn't occur to them that I wouldn't be, if that made sense, because they would just assume that any woman who was so brazenly walking around who wasn't wearing a full chador, the full sort of burqa, must be a lady of the night. And so they happily went away when I shooed them off and and clearly displayed that I wasn't very happy for them to be there. But it was almost sort of like an innocent request more than anything threatening, if that makes sense. And it sort of seems quite strange, but I think it was just a complete lack of understanding between two cultures, because we were in a very, very rural area where they wouldn't really have access even to sort of television, even if there were programs where you'd see women who weren't fully covered.
So as a result of that incident, then, were you just a little bit more cautious and sensitive by, as you continued through that sort of Muslim area?
Well, generally, I would cycle rather more covered in Muslim areas than I would, say when we got through to China or into the US. But there was, obviously, I wouldn't have to, but I would tend to, unless it was very, very strict, in which I didn't, I would roll one leg up slightly on my trousers, but not all the way up to my knee, if that makes sense. So that, it was just very hot because we were in the desert at that particular point, and I wear a top that would have sort of longer sleeves. But it was sort of a bit of a balance between wearing so many clothes, because it was 50 degrees, so wearing lots and lots of clothes, or the incredible discomfort of that, and then being offensive to the local people, and it was. I'm sure that there were some people who weren't probably as impressed by me, but I think we were more of a curiosity than anything other, because we obviously were so different from the local people. They sort of almost disassociate you from being the normal people, if that makes sense. Or this is at least how our guide explained it to us. Because I did say, should I cover up more? And when we stopped, and when we went into, say, a restaurant, I'd put a sarong around my shoulders to try and be a little bit more modest. But he did say that, while I'm on the bike, it made more sense just to, I couldn't really cycle with a sarong around my shoulders. But that people would probably view that we were such an oddity anyway, that it wouldn't really occur to them so much that I was sort of displaying a lower arm, if that makes sense. But it was interesting going through that region, and there was certainly a point where I felt that I realised that I was leaning more on the guys to go and buy food and water and do things, and just being sort of almost subconsciously standing back a little bit, which isn't necessarily my normal nature. Just because people would look at you in a certain way, or either sort of slightly confused, occasionally disparaging, but very, very rarely. But often just sort of they would stare. They would, and it wasn't even necessarily a threatening stare, but they would just stare. People would just stare at you.
Well, certainly, when I've been we went to Morocco with my wife and two daughters. We had an incident where one of the daughters was ill, so we had to go out in shifts, as it were, to make sure there was somebody there.
Yeah.
And when my wife and my daughter went out, they had a terrible time, and they really came back feeling very oppressed and very groped and all the rest of it, even though they dressed as conservatively as they possibly could. They weren't brazen at all. But so passing through that area, then, how long did it take to get through those sort of remote areas onto the next stage?
Well, when we went through Libya, which was fairly remote in the main, because there's a large section in the middle there which doesn't really see. There's not very much there, so you wouldn't go as a tourist, and you wouldn't really even go if you were a Libyan. There's not really much reason to go through, so that was quite remote. And then into the east of Egypt was also very remote, and it was brilliant though, because the police had no idea what we were doing, and so they ended up following us in a van for most of our time going across there, which we felt incredibly secure at that particular point, because we had increasing numbers of armed escort all the way across. But then we went on to the Middle East, so it's still a Muslim area, so we're still required to cover, and it wasn't necessarily just me. The guys also felt slightly as if they, not pressured to wear sort of larger clothing, but when they got off the bikes, they did tend to wear trousers and longer sleeves, just because even Muslim men tend to dress more conservatively than we would over here. So in terms of our dress and our actions, it didn't really change that much. But we did go through a lot more sort of towns and cities and that kind of thing. And we ended up going along the King's Highway in Jordan, which is a fairly well-known sort of tourist trail. So we ended up sort of going from quite a remote area in the north of Africa to a slightly more built-up area with a few more tourists and I suppose a slightly more of a Western influence, all the way really up into Syria, and we nipped across into the Lebanon as well. And again, it seems a little more in terms of sort of I suppose in terms of clothes and in actions, it was a little bit more liberal really than that very isolated area across the north of Africa. And we managed to get a beer in Damascus, so that was quite exciting.
thanks to Susie, and once again, congratulations to her, Jamie and Ian for completing their trip. A great story and very inspirational. It makes you want to get out and live life, doesn't it? So make sure you stay tuned for part 2, which will be along very soon, and see how the story concludes.
With over 1 million listeners worldwide, The Outdoor Station is the leading online audio resource for those into the great outdoors.
Podcasts are based solely around self-powered travel. If you walk, run, cycle, paddle, climb, explore or sail, we want to share your adventure, hear your highs and lows, and inspire others to go out and do more.
Online, on demand,
and always available. This is The Outdoor Station. Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear more from our extensive free library, please visit the website at theoutdoorstation.co.uk.
You can now follow The Outdoor Station on Facebook, where we chat about each program we produce, answer questions, and discuss future productions. Why not join us there?
This podcast is produced and hosted by theoutdoorstation.co.uk.